Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bullpen. All right, in the Bullpen today, we have Jeffrey Schulman, enters the Bullpen contributor, Young Voices, also is about to get his PhD, hopefully very soon. We're glad to have him on the program. Regulation versus deregulation will be the topic of today. Jeffrey, good day. Welcome to the Bullpen.
Yes, great. Thanks so much to be talking with you. Really appreciate it.
Good stuff. All right. I don't want to presume what you know or believe about regulation versus deregulation. So if you could give us your sentiment and I would then opine.
Yes, so I think one thing that's sort of been happening in the US aviation industry, you may have read, right? There's been a lot of chaos. Also, like this whole thing over the blocked merger that happened when essentially JetBlue Airlines wanted to buy Spirit Airlines. They were going to become one. The Biden administration stepped in and blocked that. And then Spirit recently declared bankruptcy. It will continue operating, but major problems. And so basically what I'm sort of arguing is that, right, Biden had an understandable idea there that you don't want these airlines just to, group into fewer and fewer and you lose competition. But that the real problem right now is there's so many regulations affecting aviation that it's just very hard for new airlines and small airlines to get in there and compete and offer cheap fares. And that's why I think, we had some deregulation a number of decades ago. But that I think we really need something like that again if we were able to sort of bring this competition back.
You had an Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, okay? And you've had some significant nuances since then. But I don't think your argument isn't you're totally against regulation. You're saying nuanced regulation, thoughtful regulation about what regulation means today or deregulation means today needs to be considered. Is that your primary argument?
Yeah, I think a good example is the pilot's retirement age, right? Which is now just set as a fixed age, 65. There was talk in the previous Congress about how you might, raise that a little. After all, right? People are living longer, performing longer, we're getting healthier. But also, right, that you could look at that instead of having a fixed number as an age, right? We now know a lot more about like your performance as a pilot than just having to tie that to a particular age. So you could adjust that to a performance test, and that would let pilots who still have their skills past 65 continue to fly, right? So I think that's exactly what you need is you need to get smarter about this to reduce some of these rules, this red tape and bureaucracy.
Let me tell you some of the challenges with that. So number one, you already have a difficult enough time finding pilots that are actually senior pilots that can fly an aircraft without having, a junior trainee with them. So you already have an issue with that. Number one, you're probably going to expand that issue if you go to your model. Number two, you have to think about the insurance carriers. There are insurance companies who are involved in the conversation about, well, if you have a pilot that's older than 65, that creates a higher liability according to the insurance company. Now, I'm not saying the insurance company is correct. What I'm saying is you have to figure out a remedy for that issue because that cost will be passed on to the consumer, thus taking away the advantage that you're trying to create for the consumer, which is a lower cost.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways you could deal with that, right? And before I just get into that, right, the reason why consumers would benefit if you did that is just that the current established airlines, they already have the pilots, right? So it's much harder to recruit new ones when there's a shortage than if you already have a supply in a pipeline. But part of the way that you'd be able to deal with those issues, for example, with insurance, right? If you come up with like a very good test system that assesses performance, so you can say, in terms of at least liability insurance, right, for these airlines, okay, this guy's going to perform just as well as a younger guy. We have proof. That means you could adjust those premiums. Likewise, right, if you were to raise this age, then you are simply increasing the pool of people who can fly. And so hopefully that's going to, bring
What
a
would you
few more
increase and
pilots
I'm
onto
only
the market.
interrupting for sake of time. What would you increase the age to for retirement?
Yeah, so I think if you're going to be smart about it, you wouldn't need to pick an age. You'd say so long as you are passing this test, right, and then you have a series of benchmarks. Of course, right, like it's possible that the test would be hard enough, right, in terms of like reaction times that nobody over a given age would just be able to pass it, right? But you'd see a slow petering off. and you'd like read about the one guy who was very old who passed it,
And what
right?
agency
But
would
it
be
wouldn't just be
in
a strict
charge?
age.
What agency would be in charge, or would this be a complementary dynamic for the airline and then an agency oversees the process? How would you roll that out?
Yep. So Congress would have to go in and make that change. And so it could choose to structure that however it wanted, whether it wanted to do that through the FAA, the Transportation Department, create, that would just be up to Congress how it wanted to structure that, because the current pilot's
Okay.
retirement age is set by
And would it be a
Congress.
simulation as a test or actual performance in flight miles?
So I think this is one case where you'd really want to be able to get experts together to sort of talk about, okay, why is it that we have this age, right? We know, for example, right, okay, right, like we have the situation, right, where like, okay, right, we know your reaction times, for example, that gets harder, right? It gets harder to operate a car when you get older. But what particularly those skills are would be something that you sort of want to leave to a panel of experts to sort of set and ask, what makes you a good pilot? What skills do you need? And which of those skills decline with age?
That would be really interesting. I think it's a heck of a conversation to continue. We haven't visited that or revisited it for a long time. It may be worth a revisit. Overall, do you believe that at least within the framework of thoughtful regulation, that regulation is a benefit in many arenas? Or are you a deregulation guy generally across the board?
I think the key, right, is to have as little regulation, as few rules as you can before it, right? But of course, right, like in something like flying, right, you don't want your plane just crashing, right? Of course, it makes sense to have some sensible rules, but generally, what happens is these things just pile up one after another. And so I think the default approach should be to reduce rather than to increase the number of rules where you have a choice in doing that.
Well, and see, that's where we really differ. Because if you don't look at each policy nuance, I'll give you an example. There are people who are
Mm,
living today because of regulation. You could look
mm,
at when regulation started, how many lives were saved from manufacturing to processing and beyond. Child labor laws, that's a whole different beast. But once again, that's because of regulation. And regulation saved children from being put in dangerous places and not having the proper training, et cetera, in order to do these very dangerous jobs. Those individuals are alive today because of regulation. Regulation also contributes to what? The elimination of usury, or at least attempting to stump out usury inside of a system. Regulation has led to an increase in minimum wage dynamics per state. And to be honest, a lot of Republicans do believe in regulation. When Donald Trump threatens a tariff, that's a regulation. That's a regulatory um, uh, utilization of the presidential power. So that regulation has no boundary basically within the confines of the presidency. So regulation is typically agreed upon when a Republican is doing it, but then when a Democrat proposes it, it becomes something adversarial.
absolutely, right. Like you make some interesting points. I think the key is though, right, that you always wind up having downsides, problems that come on, right? Say,
Yep.
for example, right, like child labor laws, right? You don't want little kids working in sweatshops, right? But what happens if you just make a law, okay, nobody under 18 can work? That I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying what if you get that, think that's a good idea. Suddenly now like a kid, can't earn money, delivering a newspaper or, serving ice cream, right? Which is, a pretty valuable experience. And so that's really a case where you have to ask yourself, okay, what is the least regulation way that we can prevent these kids from being exploited, right? Because if not, you're just preventing people from doing things that aren't only, good, but that they want to do and that develop them as people, right? Like I know I was able to work like through this program when I was, I think 14, I think it was. And we like taught kids at the summer school, just limited hours. There's a structured way to do that, for example. That wasn't exploitation, but it was like really a valuable experience for me. I
But
used the money I
think about
saved to
what you're
buy a
doing,
bicycle.
Jeffrey. Jeffrey, you're making a
Hmm.
point by arguing the fictional extreme of another. The fictional extreme that you're arguing is that a law will be passed that says no one who's 18 or under can work. That's a fictional extreme. At least utilize something that has some meat to it, has a little teeth to where you
Well,
can
I
bite
was
into it.
just talking about, and sorry for interrupting
Go
you.
ahead.
I was just talking about a law for pilots where it is exactly that extreme, where it says as soon as you're over 65, you can't work, right? not any job, but still, right? That seems like a
Right, but
pretty
in the
extreme regulation.
general context, right? So we left
Yeah,
aviation.
yeah,
I'm nuanced on the
yeah.
aviation argument, but in the
No,
general
totally.
context of regulation versus deregulation, I don't believe it's wise to go into it with a bias like that. To simply say everywhere we can deregulate, let's deregulate, let's make it as deregulated as possible, because all of a sudden you're putting people's lives in danger again, and you don't win that argument by having a contextual argument that's so extreme and fictional that nobody would support it. Nobody would ever support a person not being able to work, let's say at a restaurant, a fast food place. We all get our training based upon these elements of society that don't pay as much at the entry level, but they at least get you some on-the-job training. I'll let you get the
Yeah.
last word. We're out of time.
No, totally, right? And I think it's just that, and that in many ways we're in agreement on a lot of things, which is that you just want to look for a way that you can reduce these rules, but that you don't want to be reckless about it, right? And just get rid of everything all at once. But I do
All
think
right.
there's a smart way to go about that.
There you go. We'll have you back on, dear brother. I know we're pressed for time today, but we appreciate you being
No,
on the
this is
show.
great. Thanks so much for taking the time again.
Absolutely.